I'm Dr. Rick Chambers. I have a private practice in Newnan, Georgia. It's a private counseling practice. I grew up in Pine Mountain, and then I moved here in 1982 when I got married, and have lived in Troup County ever since. I have a Doctor of Education in Counseling, and I kind of came into these kind of issues from a counseling and psychological perspective. For instance, in talking about ethics, something that psychology does, rather than jumping into the argument about right and wrong when an issue comes up, psychology takes a step back to look at how do people reason about ethics, and to kind of look at it from a step back from just reacting to a situation. And of course, in counseling, day in, day out, you're dealing with all kinds of ethics. You're never not dealing with them.
You've referenced the Occupy movement in most, if not all, of your articles that have been published at LaGrangeCitizen.com. And in the general public, there seems to be a lot of confusion and misunderstanding about the Occupy movement. And it doesn't help that the Occupy protests in some cities have been linked to violence and destruction of property. What does the Occupy movement mean to you?
More than anything, it's kind of an opportunity to, one of the things people have agreed on is it kind of changed the discourse, the political discourse, social discourse, those kind of things. And we've been in the culture wars for quite a while, and things were kind of stuck, and there's always one side played against another. But the Occupy movement brings a different approach to things that may help us. Mainly it made me feel hopeful about the world, because it is coming from a very different direction. The other reasons, it was Occupy Wall Street, and yet it's part of a global movement. So it's not just the issues here. It's really the first response. I think Tom Freeman had a book, or a chapter in a book that said the world is 10 years old, where he said the old model of the Cold War, where there's kind of capitalism and communism, he said that debate's been over since the fall of Russia in a way. But when that debate stopped, the new model was globalization. And corporations and economics and business globalized very quickly. But individuals didn't. And so I think Occupy we're trying to catch up socially. We've been lagging behind, and we're trying to, how do you think globally? Or kind of, how do we take globalization for people? So it's global, but it's also, within 2 months of the Occupy Wall Street, there were over 2,000 local groups. And that was before our local group even formed. And so I had never seen anything like that went global and local so quickly. I think a lot of people saw it as hope and as something new.
Okay. In your last article, you suggested that corporate ethics have penetrated the political game. What do you mean by corporate ethics, and what would be the alternative?
It penetrated the political game because it has penetrated everybody's psychology. When I was in school in the 70s, the type of psychology they were teaching, and really beginning with the Enlightenment 300 years ago, but it's this idea of using rationality, but it's a particular kind of rationality that I call it the corporate game, because corporations kind of mastered it and have harnessed this way of thinking better than anything else. And they've used it to now, the same techniques that Western Europe used to kind of colonize the world have been refined, and they're now kind of how corporations are creating a world kind of in their own image. And so it's contrasted to and it's a certain way of thinking about ethics. And I wrote a good bit about kind of this term of utility or either market calculus. It's a certain way of thinking. Actual humans think in a very diverse, complicated way. They can think about utility and self-interest, but they can think about their concrete social relationships. And those things aren't really based on utility often. There's also an ethical approach that's based on like a transcendent lawgiver or a higher authority. And so that's very opposed to this idea of like utilitarian thinking and then in self-benefit. And then the postmodern world comes in with this idea of like a lot of our thoughts of ethics are culturally based and culturally determined. And so that's another way of thinking about ethics. And then I would say like myth and poetry thinks about ethics in a different way. So what I wanted people to know, there's not one way. The real individuals are often pretty balanced. But an institution can't think in terms of a transcendent authority. They can't think in terms of cultural relativity. I mean, they can in order to get markets and things like that, but not in terms of how they define themselves. And they can't think in terms kind of concrete relationships. That would be like a CEO thinking of what's the impact to the people I'm laying off? What's the impact to their lives? So what I'm hoping to promote is this idea that there are multiple ways. Humans naturally think in multiple ways. But over the last 30 years, we've been, in one of the quotes it said like social engineering. We've kind of been trained to think utility is the only way and always the best way to think about things. Mm-hmm. And people ask, how did we get this world full of greed? Well, if you start with utility, you're going to end with greed.
And that's very much related to the next question I had. In the same article, you contrasted consumers and citizens. Can you speak a little bit more about the differences you see between consumers and citizens?
Yes. Another contribution that's kind of come in the postmodern world, there's this thing called identity narratives. Citizen comes with its own identity, but so does consumer. And so in a way, after World War II, in order to keep the economy humming, they began to get people to identify with this idea of being consumers. It was a necessary step. And then more and more it became the best way to contribute to your country is to consume. And so a consumer, it became like our purpose, our meaning, our community is determined by it. It began to take over larger and larger areas of our life and to push out other identities, a religious identity, a racial identity, or any other identities. It began, or an identity such as citizen. So a citizen is just much more multifaceted. And consumers can really only buy at the end of the day. And they can only buy what the markets are offering. And some of the frustration is markets aren't offering what we really need as humans. Mm-hmm. Markets never owned that.
I guess you might say the function of a consumer is just to consume. So what would you see as the function of a citizen?
America kind of in a way pioneered this concept of citizen. Mm-hmm. And it's been this long-running debate between how do you create as much freedom as possible, kind of optimal freedom and self-determination and those kind of things, but not at the expense of other people. And so a citizen also is responsible for thinking about their own in a utilitarian way of thinking about their own self-benefit. But I think a citizen has a mandate to think about the good of the whole. And so citizens hold this tension between the good of the individual and the good of the community. Larger communities that they're a part of. And that can be on the local level, a state level, a national level, or a global level. And so citizen is an identity that I think a person could be very proud of. And I think people want to function in society that way.
The word citizen seems to have become a hot word or a buzzword.
Yes.
And you also wrote that the word citizen itself has become co-opted. What do you mean by that?
Another reason I was interested in the Occupy movement is it relates back to the hippies and the 60s. They called it the counterculture. There was a certain culture that was developing, and then there was this effort to develop an alternative culture. So it was counter, or seen as counterculture. And it splintered and divided throughout. I became an adult kind of at the last stages of that. And all of these movements that were started in the 60s were kind of splintered, and now they've come back together. But at one point in the 60s, they had this idea of they even had a funeral for the death of the hippie, because they realized that Madison Avenue was selling love beads and tie-dye shirts, and you're seeing a return of those kind of things. What we've never faced is this particular type of capitalism. Every new idea somehow gets incorporated and co-opted into kind of the culture. And so it gets very hard to kind of, we haven't experienced anything that can kind of stand against that. And yet the Occupy movement, a lot of people felt like, and they learned in the battle that was happening in Wisconsin over unions and kind of public service unions, they felt the Democratic Party kind of came in and co-opted with their own agenda. And it lost what they were really fighting for and became part of this larger. And so that is why the Occupy movement kind of, what they took from that, the only way to keep from being co-opted is to kind of not have leaders and not have an agenda. Now that creates its own problems. Yeah.
You argue that corporations cannot be citizens. Why not?
I'm really hoping people can kind of get in their minds, and we can kind of return to a lot of this stuff. A lot of it is cutting edge new, and a lot of it is really, really old school. It is this idea of only humans with a body can be a citizen. Because with bodies, there's a lifespan. We're all kind of on a level playing field there. It's what, and corporations don't have any of the things, if you're talking about ethics, issues like trust, or even consequences and things like kind of to be thrown in jail. Like you can throw a body in jail, but you can't really throw a corporation in jail. And so in a way, they are kind of benefiting from, they're using, again, they've kind of co-opted this idea of citizen and of rights. But really kind of what binds us all is this idea of we have bodies. And so I'm kind of thinking that's a good way around some of these arguments and things. If we can return to the idea, like for instance, people will say like you vote with your dollars. Well, kind of one body, one vote makes sense to me. It's a big equalizer. But if you're voting with your dollars, there's no way a millionaire gets 1 million votes. And then somebody that's indigent has no votes. So in the corporation game, see, you're not even a player if you can't be a customer. So what happens to you? can't be on their radar.